We can call this Hellraiser 2022 or Hellraiser 11, because there's already a movie called Hellraiser from 1987, and it has a very similar plot. Hellraiser is a franchise for people who are really into BDSM. I'm not here to kink shame people who are into body suspension, where they hang themselves from hooks as performance art, but I'm really not into all of that, so Hellraiser was one of the last horror franchises I delved into. People having their skin peeled back by hooks, it just makes my skin crawl to watch. But let's get out of our comfort zone a little with a Hellraiser reboot. Why not? Oh, eternal pain and suffering? That might be a good reason not to. Screw it, let's do it anyway. The early Hellraiser films are part of what I will call mascot horror, a subgenre popular in the 1980s with movies like Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street, born out of franchises like Halloween and Texas Chainsaw Massacre. However, every one of these franchises eventually turned rotten. Friday the 13th wasn't even very good to begin with, didn't find itself until around the third movie, and then lost itself again a few films later. Mascot horror films usually have a classic first film, followed by progressively worse sequels. The first Hellraiser movie was based on a novella Clive Barker published in 1986 called The Hellbound Heart. It was influenced by Barker's life as a male prostitute and time spent in S&M clubs. Barker wrote and directed the original film, which was going to receive an X rating, but was cut down to receive an R instead. Hellraiser told a simple story about a dead criminal being brought back to life through a series of sacrifices and a magic puzzle box that could open a portal into a hellish nightmare world. The original film has definitely secured its place as a 1980s horror classic, with plenty of gore and lore. With each sequel, the lore was deepened, but it also became harder to take seriously. Pinhead was originally just an unnamed Cenobite, Cenobites being the pain-obsessed demons from the nightmare world, but his iconic look made him the mascot of the franchise. Is there anybody else out there who hears the name Cenobites and just thinks about Cinnabons? Or is that just me? As the lore of the Cenobites is established more in the sequels, it becomes more of a dark fantasy, and it's just hard for me to take any of it seriously. In fact, the third movie told the backstory of Pinhead as a fighter in World War I. The more dialogue and backstory that's given to Pinhead, the goofier it gets.
There is no good, Monroe. There is no evil. There is only flesh.
Barker provided the story for the second film, but after that, he was only featured as a producer. Let me explain the lore behind Hellraiser for the uninitiated. The magic puzzle cube opens a gateway to another dimension. It might not literally be hell, but it's a pretty hellish place. Each time the puzzle box is solved, it will cut the user. The user is then slowly pulled into the hell dimension where they will be tortured and ripped apart by chains, like it's Dante's Inferno. A lot of Hellraiser feels like torture porn to me, which is not really one of my favorite subgenres of horror. I appreciate the makeup and costume design in these films, though. It feels like the focus on the sequels was more on creating crazy visuals than telling a coherent story. Hellraiser 4 Bloodline was the last film Clive Barker was involved with, and he only produced. It's where the series got really terrible. It's actually one of those movies where the studio took the film away from the director and recut it, so the director used the industry pseudonym Alan Smithee to distance himself from the project. When a movie is directed by Alan Smithee, it usually means it sucks. In Hellraiser 4 Bloodline, we're jumping from outer space scenes set in the future, back to France in 1796, and then back to the modern day. When a horror film goes to outer space, you know it's lost the plot. There's a character here whose name is actually Rimmer. Every time I hear someone say Rimmer, I can't help but laugh.
What's your name?
Rimmer.
If you don't get why Rimmer is a funny name, then don't worry about it, let's just move on.
I'm playing the endgame here, Rimmer. Finishing something that began centuries ago, and I don't have the time to help you understand.
Are any of the Hellraiser sequels good, outside of maybe the first one?
No.
Thank you, Adam Scott, I agree. And I'm sure this is the role you're most proud of.
Yes.
By Hellraiser 5, the first direct-to-video film in the franchise, the series isn't even about Pinhead anymore, which at this point was the face of the franchise. There are 5 more Hellraiser sequels after this. Hellraiser 6, Hellseeker, Hellraiser 7, Deader. That's a really uninspired subtitle. Hellraiser 8, Hellworld, Hellraiser 9, Revelations, and Hellraiser 10, Judgment. I've never ventured past Hellraiser 5 because I'm just not willing to journey that far into hell. I'll dip my toes in a little, that's about it. I enjoy this reboot from a production standpoint. The set of the mansion where the conclusion takes place is elaborate and ornate. The lighting looks natural for the most part, except for scenes where the set is doused in red, a trick used in the director's last film, The Night House, which was used to separate the worlds of light and darkness. This new Hellraiser has the same writers and director as The Night House, a film which I praised for its subtle horror and character development. Unfortunately, this new Hellraiser doesn't break free of its shackles as a franchise film. I'm not crazy about the writing in this one. There's too much dialogue that exists merely for the sake of exposition. There are a lot of scenes with characters just explaining the lore. All of these characters, except for the lead, feel like one-note victims in a slasher movie.
This is my brother Matt, and this is his boyfriend Colin.
Hey.
Hey. Nora, the roommate.
The dramatic scenes are reduced to characters just yelling loudly at each other. There's a lot of unnatural exposition in these arguments, giving us the information about Riley's drug addiction and her placement in a 12-step program.
What kind of guy hooks up with someone from a 12-step program? Honestly.
What?
Instead of crafting scenes that would display this information, we just have characters yell at each other about it. Exposition becomes a problem in this film because the lore can be confusing.
This is not the first configuration. Who touched it?
You have to cut a certain amount of people using the magic box. Just make sure you don't get cut yourself. And then you get some kind of awful reward where you turn into a mutated creature. There's an exposition dump about 40 minutes in, and in case you're new to the franchise, Riley eventually discovers the Hellraiser Cliff Notes, just in case the world building was too convoluted for you. I thought with the writers and director behind The Night House, this reboot of Hellraiser would be more cerebral with better character development, but it really just feels like some of the longtime fans of the franchise are doing their best to make yet another Hellraiser movie. There's a famous line associated with Hellraiser that gets referenced again and again. We have such sights to show you. There are all kind of famous Hellraiser quotes, and they're all corny edgelord caliber. No tears, please, it's a waste of good suffering. It makes me glad that Michael Myers, Jason Voorhees, and Leatherface never had dialogue. Remember that iconic scene from the first Halloween where Mike Myers turns to the camera and says, "It's Halloweening time," right before he stabs a dude? That was my favorite part of Halloween. The protagonist, Riley, is a recovering drug addict in a 12-step program. She's dating this guy she met in the program, and her brother doesn't like it. Her brother Matt and his partner Colin have given Riley a place to stay, but there's conflict because they don't want her hanging out with this guy that she met in recovery named Trevor. Matt and Colin don't really have any personality traits outside of the fact that they're gay, and they don't really have goals or obstacles. The characters are all just there for the body count. Trevor tells Riley that he has a heist planned to steal a magic box so they can get some money. This sets the plot in motion. Riley has a big fight with Matt where he kicks her out, so she takes some drugs, unlocks the first configuration of the box, and passes out on a playground. Matt discovers Riley and gets pricked by the box, sending him into the demon realm, and the rest of the film is about Riley trying to rescue him. Pretty conventional setup. Matt and Colin have a roommate, Nora, who is only in the movie so that the Cenobites can stick pins through her neck in a gross scene where we see and hear the inside of her throat as it's pierced from one side to the other. All this weird fetish stuff just makes me uncomfortable. I suppose it's doing its job, but what does Hellraiser have to say about fetishizing pain other than if you take it too far it can be harmful? The Cenobites are all people who are obsessed with the boundaries of pleasure and pain, and the dialogue is always about pushing these boundaries. It makes sense that the main character is a drug addict, as drug addiction also becomes about pushing the boundaries of pleasure and pain. The pleasure of consuming a drug, the pain of either going without a drug or taking too much of a drug. However, the film ultimately doesn't have that much to say about addiction. It's going to appeal to Hellraiser fans who simply want interesting creature design and unsettling torture scenes. But they really missed an opportunity to truly reboot the franchise and take it in a new direction. I think they should have taken more risks with this film, instead of just playing it safe. Roland Voigt, a character obviously based on Armie Hammer, is a secret antagonist because we're supposed to think he's dead after the opening scene. So in Hellraiser lore, if you can get 6 people sacrificed by having their blood drawn by the magic box, then you get a reward, but it's monkey's paw style, where the reward actually sucks ass. So Roland Voigt chose the reward of sensation, and he gets this gold phallic device built into him that twists his nerve endings around so that he's always in a state of pain or pleasure. The Cenobites don't distinguish between pain and pleasure. It's part of the whole BDSM subtext to the movie. The Cenobites are the original edgelords. They're all dressed in black leather bondage gear, covered in piercings. It's fine if you're into that, but they really do take it to the extreme. There's a new female version of Pinhead. The costume design is similar to the original, just with a female voice. There's the return of the teeth-chattering Cenobite. There's a new one called the Weeper, with their eyes pried open, and another one called the Asphyx. He's based on autoerotic asphyxiation and has foreskin covering his face so he has a hard time breathing. It turns out that the Cenobites themselves count for blood sacrifices as victims of the box, so if you just cut into one of them with the box, then they explode. So the heroes need to trap a few Cenobites, and then Riley can bring back her brother Matt. Riley is given the choice to sacrifice her friends to bring back her brother, but isn't tempted enough by it to make for interesting dramatic conflict. The final act is all about the human survivors versus the Cenobites. It's a little too predictable and formulaic. Roland has been hiding away in misery for years, and in a reveal that everyone saw coming, he's the one that sent Trevor to obtain the box so that he could get a new wish, because his wish for sensation ended up in suffering. It turns out Trevor, the guy who convinced his girlfriend to do a robbery with him, is actually a bad guy. And surely one of the other wishes will work out a lot better for Roland. You get the choice of life, knowledge, love, sensation, resurrection, or power. Or, as the movie has dubbed them, lamentation, lore, laudorant, liminal, Lazarus, and Leviathan. So they're all L words. How cute. In the end, Roland ditches sensation and chooses power, which means he gets crucified in the clouds and his face is slowly peeled apart. How is that power? What would love be? Someone eating your heart one tiny piece at a time? Riley chooses not to bring back Matt because it would probably end with her having her skin flayed or something. At least she's aware enough to understand this. Hellraiser 2022 is one of the better Hellraiser sequels, only because the Hellraiser sequels are all so awful. I haven't seen half of them, but they probably don't get much better after the 5th. By the 3rd movie, a guy was getting murdered by compact discs, so the series had already landed in hilariously bad territory. This just isn't a series that I'm that into. The director and writers couldn't make it original enough for me to love. Longtime fans of Hellraiser will probably get a kick out of this, but for me, it's slightly above average. A 6 out of 10. Maybe even a 6 2/3, but rounded back down to 6 instead of up to 7 because that's the way my review scores work. It doesn't have to make sense. I think what we need for a great Hellraiser reboot would be to scale back the lore a little, make it more focused on the human characters and their obstacles, and a little less on the Cenobites and torture porn. even though Cenobites and torture porn are the pillars of the franchise. If I wanted to watch torture porn, I could just watch The Passion of the Christ. In fact, I've written a screenplay for a horror reboot/sequel of The Passion of the Christ. The Passion of the Christ 2, Antichrist Rising. Why isn't anyone giving me money to make that movie?